The morning sun cast long shadows across the colonial settlement of New Eden as 8-year-old Marcus Chen raced through the wheat fields, his laughter echoing across the peaceful valley. The golden stalk swayed gently in the breeze, creating waves that seemed to dance just for him. His small hands brushed against the grain as he ran, pretending he was flying through clouds of gold. "Marcus, breakfast," his mother's voice called from their modest, prefabricated home. The settlement consisted of 53 families, all part of humanity's third wave of expansion into the Kepler 442 system. They had chosen this world for its Earth-like qualities and its distance from the major shipping lanes. Peace was what they sought, and peace was what they had found. The boy skidded to a halt, his shoes kicking up small clouds of the reddish soil that made this planet unique. Above him, the twin suns of Kepler 442 painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. It was a beautiful morning, like so many others since the colonists had arrived 3 years ago. Nothing suggested that this day would be different, that it would be remembered across the galaxy for centuries to come. Dr. Sarah Chen watched her son through the kitchen window as she prepared his favorite breakfast of synthetic eggs and real bacon. The bacon was a luxury, shipped from Earth at enormous cost, but seeing Marcus's face light up made every credit worthwhile. Her husband Thomas was already in the fields checking the irrigation systems. Life on New Eden was simple but good. The settlement had been established without fanfare or military escort. Humans had learned that their aggressive expansion in the early days of interstellar colonization had made them enemies among the galactic community. The Zelkan Confederacy, in particular, viewed human expansion with suspicion and barely contained hostility. So New Eden was meant to be different, a peaceful agricultural colony that posed no threat to anyone. The colonists had followed every protocol. They had registered their claim with the Galactic Settlement Authority. They had submitted to inspections by Zelkan officials. They had agreed to limits on their technology and population growth. They had done everything right, everything by the book to avoid conflict. Marcus burst through the front door, his face flushed from running. "Mom, did you see how fast I was going?" "I was like a starfighter zooming through asteroid fields." He made whooshing sounds while gesturing wildly with his arms. Sarah smiled, ruffling his dark hair. "Slower than a starfighter, I hope, or you might crash into something." She set his plate down on the table. "Eat up. Mrs. Rodriguez is expecting you for lessons in an hour." The settlement had no formal school building yet, but the colonists took turns educating their children. Mrs. Rodriguez, a former university professor, taught mathematics and sciences. Mr. Kim handled history and literature. Dr. Patel covered biology and medicine. It was a community effort that had been working well. As Marcus ate, his tablet chimed with a message from his best friend, Luna Okafor. Her family lived on the other side of the settlement near the communications array. "Marcus, come quick. My dad is picking up something weird on the long-range sensors." Dr. Okafor was the settlement's communications officer and amateur astronomer. His equipment was primarily designed for maintaining contact with Earth and monitoring weather patterns, but he had modified it to scan the surrounding star systems. It was a hobby that had proven useful for predicting solar flares and cosmic storms. Marcus wolfed down his breakfast and kissed his mother goodbye. "I'll be back for lunch," he called as he ran out the door. Sarah watched him go, a familiar warmth spreading through her chest. This was why they had come so far from Earth, to give their children a chance to grow up in open spaces, away from the crowded cities and polluted skies of humanity's homeworld. The morning air was crisp and clean as Marcus ran toward the Okafor residence. He passed other families going about their daily routines. Mr. Johansson was tending to his vegetable garden. The Nakamura twins were helping their father repair a water pump. Everyone waved and smiled as he passed. New Eden was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where children were safe to run freely, where the future seemed bright and unlimited. Luna was waiting for him by the communications building, her eyes wide with excitement. At 7 years old, she was already showing signs of inheriting her father's passion for astronomy. "Marcus, you have to see this. Dad thinks there might be ships coming." Inside the communications center, Dr. Okafor was bent over his instruments, his brow furrowed with concentration. The screens showed various readouts that meant nothing to the children but everything to him. "It's definitely artificial," he murmured. The signatures are consistent with Zelkan propulsion systems, but there are too many of them. Far too many for a routine inspection. Are they coming to visit? Marcus asked innocently. He'd been too young to remember the last Zelkan inspection, and his parents had always spoken of aliens with careful neutrality. Dr. Okafor's expression darkened. I don't know, son, but we should probably let the council know. He began typing rapidly on his communication console, sending alerts to the settlement's leadership. Within an hour, every adult in New Eden knew that a Zelkan fleet was approaching. The ships would arrive within days, possibly hours if they were traveling at maximum speed. Emergency meetings were called. Communication attempts were made, but there was no response from the approaching vessels. As the day wore on, tension filled the air like a gathering storm. Parents called their children inside. Work crews abandoned their projects. The peaceful rhythm of colonial life began to fracture under the weight of uncertainty. Marcus didn't understand why the adults suddenly seemed so worried. He couldn't comprehend why his mother held him tighter that evening, or why his father spent long hours staring at the sky. To him, visitors from space sounded exciting, not frightening. That night, as the family gathered for dinner, the conversation was subdued. Thomas had contacted the colonial administration on Kepler Prime, but help was weeks away. Earth was months away. Whatever was coming, New Eden would face it alone. Will the alien visitors want to see my drawings? Marcus asked, showing his parents a picture he had made of their farm under the twin suns. Sarah's eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. I'm sure they would love them, sweetheart. Outside, the first Zelkan ships appeared as moving stars against the darkening sky. The Zelkan ships descended from the morning sky like falling stars, their hulls gleaming with an oily, iridescent sheen that hurt human eyes to look upon directly. 27 vessels in total, far more than any previous inspection had ever required. The smallest was the size of a human destroyer, while the largest dwarfed anything in Earth's colonial fleet. Commander Vexhai stood on the bridge of the flagship Righteous Cleansing, his forearms crossed in a gesture of contempt. His species had evolved from predatory pack hunters on a world where only the strongest survived. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, with chitinous gray skin and compound eyes that could track multiple targets simultaneously, he cut an intimidating figure even among his own kind. These humans sicken me, he hissed to his second-in-command. Look how they scurry about like insects. They think their pathetic defenses will save them. The Zelkan Confederacy had been watching New Eden for months. What had started as routine surveillance had revealed something that made Vexhai's blood burn with righteous anger. The humans had been lying. Their settlement was not the simple farming community they had claimed to be. Deep beneath the wheat fields, Zelkan sensors had detected the unmistakable signatures of weapons manufacturing. The humans were producing plasma rifles, particle beam arrays, and shield generators. To Vexhai, this was proof of humanity's duplicitous nature. They pretended to be peaceful while secretly preparing for war. What the Zelkan commander didn't know, what their advanced sensors couldn't detect, was that the weapons were actually agricultural tools. The plasma systems were soil purifiers. The particle beams were grain processors. The shield generators protected the crops from solar storms. But Vexhai's hatred of humans ran so deep that he saw only what he expected to see: treachery and threat. On the surface, settlement leader Catherine Morrison tried desperately to establish communication. She had been elected to lead New Eden because of her diplomatic experience and her calm demeanor under pressure. Now both qualities were being tested to their limits. Zelkan vessels, this is New Eden settlement. We acknowledge your arrival and request permission to speak with your commanding officer. We are in full compliance with all colonial regulations, and welcome your inspection. The response came in the form of energy blasts that vaporized the communications array. Dr. Okafor barely had time to push Luna and Marcus to the ground before the building exploded around them. The children screamed as debris rained down. Their innocent world suddenly transformed into a nightmare of smoke and fire. Everyone to the emergency shelters. Morrison's voice echoed across the settlement's public address system. The colonists had drilled for this scenario, though none had believed it would ever be necessary. Families grabbed emergency supplies and ran for the reinforced bunkers that had been built into the hillsides. Thomas Chen scooped Marcus into his arms while Sarah gathered their emergency kit. The boy was crying, confused and terrified by the sudden violence. "Daddy, why are they shooting at us? What did we do wrong?" Thomas had no answer. None of them did. They had followed every rule, submitted to every inspection, made every compromise, yet here they were, under attack by the very species they had tried so hard to appease. The Zelkin ground assault began within minutes of the orbital bombardment. Dropships spat out teams of Zelkin shock troops, their powered armor gleaming with weapons and sensors. They moved with the coordinated precision of a military force that had conducted dozens of similar operations, but this was different from their usual campaigns against rebellious colonies or hostile alien species. New Eden offered no resistance. There were no defensive turrets, no military installations, no armed soldiers. The colonists simply ran for shelter, hoping their compliance would save them. Commander Vexhai observed the assault from his command center, his compound eyes tracking multiple data streams simultaneously. The lack of resistance puzzled him momentarily, but he dismissed it as cowardice. Humans were known for their deceptive nature. They were probably luring his forces into a trap. "Burn it all," he commanded. "Show no mercy to these lying mammals." The first civilian casualties came when a family of 5 was caught in the open while trying to reach shelter. The Zelkin troops opened fire without warning, their energy weapons reducing the humans to ash in seconds. The children died still clutching their parents' hands. In shelter beta, Marcus huddled between his parents, his small body shaking with each explosion that rocked the reinforced walls. The shelter held 37 people, mostly families with children. They had enough supplies for a week, but no one believed the attack would last that long. Mrs. Rodriguez tried to keep the children calm by leading them in quiet songs, but her voice trembled with barely contained terror. Dr. Patel moved from person to person, checking for injuries and offering what comfort he could. Everyone looked to Catherine Morrison for answers she didn't have. "The colonial administration will send help," she said, though she knew it would take weeks for any rescue force to arrive. "We just have to hold out until then." Above ground, the Zelkin forces systematically destroyed everything humans had built. They burned the crops, demolished the houses, and contaminated the water supplies. It wasn't enough to kill the colonists. They wanted to erase every trace of human presence from this world. The attack continued for 3 days. The shelters held, but the psychological pressure was enormous. Food and water began to run low. The air recyclers struggled to cope with so many people in such confined spaces. Children cried constantly, and several adults were showing signs of complete breakdown. On the 3rd night, Marcus couldn't sleep. The explosions had stopped hours ago, but the silence was somehow worse than the noise had been. He could hear his mother crying softly, trying not to wake anyone. His father was standing guard by the sealed entrance, a farming tool in his hands, the only weapon available. "Mommy," Marcus whispered, "are the bad aliens going to hurt us?" Sarah pulled him close, breathing in the scent of his hair. "I don't know, baby. But Daddy and I will protect you no matter what happens." It was a promise she desperately wanted to keep but feared she couldn't. Outside, the Zelkin forces were preparing for the final phase of their operation. They had located all the shelters and were bringing up heavy drilling equipment to breach the reinforced walls. Commander Vexhai was pleased with the progress. The human infestation would be completely eliminated within hours. Another world would be cleansed of their corrupting presence. The Confederacy's leaders would reward him for his efficiency and thoroughness. He never questioned whether the colonists might actually be innocent. In his mind, all humans were guilty by the simple fact of their existence. They were a cancer in the galaxy, spreading from world to world, consuming resources and corrupting everything they touched. As dawn broke over the devastated settlement, the drilling began. The sound echoed through the shelters like the footsteps of approaching death. Parents held their children tighter. Some prayed to whatever gods they still believed in. Others simply waited for the end. Marcus pressed his face against his mother's chest, trying to block out the terrible noise. He thought about his drawings now burned to ash. He thought about the wheat fields where he used to run. He thought about Luna, who was in another shelter, probably just as scared as he was. The drill bits broke through the first wall just as the twin suns reached their zenith. The message from New Eden arrived at the Sol System relay station on a Tuesday morning that would forever divide human history into before and after. Communications specialist Janet Torres was finishing her night shift when the encrypted transmission triggered every priority alert on her console. The signal was weak, fragmented, and desperate. Dr. Okafor's dying equipment had managed to compress hours of horror into a few minutes of quantum-encoded data. As Janet began the decryption process, she had no idea she was about to witness something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The first images were of children running through wheat fields under twin suns. Marcus Chen's laughter echoed through the communications center, a sound of pure innocence that made Janet smile despite her exhaustion. She assumed she was looking at routine colony footage, perhaps a family message or documentary project. Then came the ships. The Zelkin vessels descended from the sky like harbingers of doom, their weapons already charging as they approached the peaceful settlement. Janet's smile faded as she watched the systematic destruction unfold frame by frame, the communication array exploding, families running for shelter, the methodical burning of everything humans had built. But it was the final segment that broke her. The children's faces, filled with confusion and terror as they were separated from their parents. Marcus reaching for his mother, Luna crying for her father, the thermal charges igniting in a flash that turned innocence into ash. Janet found herself on the floor of the communications center, vomiting until nothing remained in her stomach but bile and horror. She had worked in military communications for 15 years. She had seen battle footage, casualty reports, and war crimes. But nothing had prepared her for this. Within an hour, the message was racing through every level of Earth's government and military hierarchy. President Elena Vasquez was pulled from a cabinet meeting to view the footage in a secured briefing room. Secretary of Defense Michael Chang had to excuse himself twice to compose himself. Admiral Sarah Kim, the most decorated officer in the human fleet, wept openly as she watched children die for the crime of existing. The initial response was shock, then disbelief, then a rage so pure it seemed to burn the very air in the room. These weren't enemy combatants or military targets. They were farmers, teachers, children. They had done everything right, followed every rule, submitted to every inspection. How many? President Vasquez asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 136 confirmed dead, reported Intelligence Director James Park. 24 of them children under the age of 12. The youngest was 3 years old. The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the room was a parent, grandparent, or had been a child once themselves. The images of Marcus Chen running through golden fields would be burned into their memories forever, along with the knowledge of how his story ended. Admiral Kim was the first to speak. "What are our military options?" "Limited," Secretary Chang replied. "Our closest battle group is 6 weeks out from New Eden. By the time we arrive, the Zelkin forces will be long gone." "Then we follow them home," Kim said, her voice as cold as space itself. "We find every ship, every commander, every order giver involved in this atrocity. And we make them pay." President Vasquez held up a hand. "We need to think carefully about this. Humanity has spent decades trying to integrate peacefully with the galactic community. If we respond with military action—" "Madam President," Admiral Kim interrupted, her composure finally cracking. "They murdered children. They burned babies alive for the crime of being human. There is no integration with a species that views our children as vermin to be exterminated." The debate that followed would rage for days, but the outcome was inevitable. The footage from New Eden was leaked to the public within hours, despite all attempts at containment. The reaction was immediate and explosive. On Luna Base, construction workers threw down their tools and demanded immediate military transport to the nearest recruitment station. The asteroid mining crews of the Belt transmitted formal requests to be armed and organized into militia units. Even the pacifist colonies of the Centauri system sent messages pledging their support for military action. Dr. Elizabeth Kane, humanity's leading xenobiologist and a vocal advocate for peaceful coexistence, watched the footage in her laboratory on Europa. She had dedicated her career to understanding alien species, to building bridges between different forms of life. But as she saw Marcus Chen reaching desperately for his mother, something fundamental broke inside her brilliant mind. "They're not people," she whispered to her empty lab. "They're monsters wearing the mask of civilization." The phrase would become a rallying cry, spreading across human space faster than any official communication. Within days, it was being chanted in the streets of Earth's megacities. painted on the hulls of mining ships and broadcast from every colonial settlement in human space. Fleet Admiral Harrison Burke, the architect of humanity's peaceful expansion policy, resigned his commission in a public ceremony broadcast across all human worlds. "I spent 30 years teaching our military to show restraint," he said, his dress uniform heavy with medals earned through diplomacy rather than warfare. "I convinced an entire generation of officers that violence was humanity's past, not its future. I was wrong, dead wrong, and 24 children paid the price for my mistakes." Burke's resignation letter became the most widely distributed document in human history. In it, he detailed every compromise, every concession, every moment of weakness that had led to New Eden. He called for the immediate mobilization of humanity's entire military capability and the appointment of Admiral Kim to lead what he termed the last war humanity would ever need to fight. The industrial response was staggering. Shipyards that had been producing civilian vessels for decades retooled overnight to build warships. Mining operations shifted their focus from rare earth elements to weapons-grade materials. Even the orbital habitats around Jupiter began manufacturing military supplies, their massive populations working around the clock. But it wasn't just about military hardware. The footage from New Eden had awakened something primal in the human psyche, something that had been dormant since the species first looked up at the stars and dreamed of peace among them. The warrior spirit that had carried humanity from caves to starships was rising again, fueled by an emotion older than civilization itself, the rage of a parent species whose children had been harmed. Dr. Marcus Thompson, the colony ship designer who had helped plan New Eden, locked himself in his workshop for 72 hours. When he emerged, he carried the blueprints for something the galaxy had never seen. A ship designed not for exploration or trade, but for the single purpose of carrying human vengeance to the stars. The ship class would be named after the boy who had died in the ashes of his dreams. The Marcus-class dreadnought would become the backbone of humanity's response, each vessel carrying enough firepower to sterilize a world and the will to use it without hesitation. In the depths of the Martian Military Academy, instructors began updating their curricula. Courses on diplomatic protocol were replaced with classes on total warfare. Students who had been learning the art of peaceful negotiation were now studying the science of complete destruction. The change was so rapid and comprehensive that visiting alien diplomats noticed the shift within days. Ambassador Kethavar of the Rigelian Collective reported to his superiors that humanity appeared to be undergoing some form of cultural transformation. His reports described a species that seemed to be shedding its civilized facade and revealing something far more dangerous underneath. He was more right than he knew. The humans who had begged for acceptance into galactic society were gone, replaced by something the galaxy had hoped never to face: a united, enraged, and technologically advanced species with nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. As the news spread to the farthest human settlements, a single message began appearing on every communication channel, in every language humanity had ever spoken. It was simple, direct, and terrifying in its implications. Remember New Eden. Remember Marcus Chen. Remember that they killed our children. The age of human mercy was over. The time of reckoning had begun. 6 months after New Eden, human space had transformed into something unrecognizable. The peaceful trading posts and research stations had been replaced by military installations that bristled with weapons and swarmed with warships. The change was so dramatic that alien visitors often wondered if they had somehow entered the territory of an entirely different species. Admiral Sarah Kim stood on the bridge of the newly commissioned UES Vengeance, the first of the Marcus-class dreadnoughts to roll out of the accelerated production lines. The ship was a monument to human engineering pushed beyond all previous limits: 3 kilometers of hardened battle steel, quantum-shielded armor, and weapon systems that could crack moons. Behind her stretched the largest military fleet humanity had ever assembled: 347 warships of various classes, from nimble destroyers to massive dreadnoughts, all bearing the same message painted on their hulls: Remember New Eden. The fleet represented every shipyard, every colony, every world that humanity had settled, united in purpose for the first time in the species' history. Dr. Elizabeth Kane, now serving as the fleet's xenobiological warfare specialist, approached the admiral with her latest report. The brilliant scientist had transformed herself as completely as her species, trading her peaceful research for the dark art of understanding how to kill alien life forms most effectively. "Admiral, we've finished mapping the Zelkan nervous system," she reported, her voice clinical and cold. "Their compound eyes are their greatest strength, but also their most exploitable weakness. A specific frequency of electromagnetic pulse will cause permanent blindness and severe neurological damage." Admiral Kim nodded, filing the information away with dozens of other tactical advantages her people had discovered. Human scientists had spent the past 6 months studying every aspect of Zelkan biology, psychology, and technology, not to understand them better, but to kill them more efficiently. The intelligence reports arriving from across the galaxy painted a clear picture of the enemy they faced. The Zelkan Confederacy controlled over 200 star systems, commanded fleets numbered in the thousands, and had the backing of several other alien species who viewed humanity as an upstart race that needed to be contained. But intelligence worked both ways. The Zelkans had been monitoring human space with growing alarm, watching as peaceful colonies transformed into military strongholds overnight. Their initial reports had dismissed humanity's response as primitive emotional outbursts that would burn out quickly. They were beginning to realize how wrong they had been. Commander Vex High, the architect of New Eden's destruction, had been recalled to the Confederacy capital to brief the High Council on his successful cleansing operation. He expected commendations and perhaps a promotion. Instead, he found himself facing questions about why his simple police action had apparently triggered a species-wide military mobilization. "You assured us that humans were cowards," High Counselor Zethmar hissed, her forearms gesturing at intelligence reports that covered the council chamber's walls. "You said they would submit to superior force as they always have. Explain to us why their military production has increased by 3,000%. Vex-High's mandibles clicked nervously. "Honored Counselor, the human response is merely the death throes of a species that knows it is beaten. They posture and threaten, but they lack. 6 months after New Eden, human space had transformed into something unrecognizable. The peaceful trading posts and research stations had been replaced by military installations that bristled with weapons and swarmed with warships. The change was so dramatic that alien visitors often wondered if they had somehow entered the territory of an entirely different species." Admiral Sarah Kim stood on the bridge of the newly commissioned UES Vengeance, the first of the Marcus-class dreadnoughts to roll out of the accelerated production lines. The ship was a monument to human engineering pushed beyond all previous limits. 3 kilometers of hardened battle steel, quantum-shielded armor, and weapon systems that could crack moons. Behind her stretched the largest military fleet humanity had ever assembled, 347 warships of various classes, from nimble destroyers to massive dreadnoughts, all bearing the same message painted on their hulls. "Remember New Eden." The fleet represented every shipyard, every colony, every world that humanity had settled, united in purpose for the first time in the species' history. Dr. Elizabeth Kane, now serving as the fleet's xenobiological warfare specialist, approached the admiral with her latest report. The brilliant scientist had transformed herself as completely as her species, trading her peaceful research for the dark art of understanding how to kill alien life forms most effectively. "Admiral, we've finished mapping the Zelkan nervous system," she reported, her voice clinical and cold. "Their compound eyes are their greatest strength, but also their most exploitable weakness. A specific frequency of electromagnetic pulse will cause permanent blindness and severe neurological damage." Admiral Kim nodded, filing the information away with dozens of other tactical advantages her people had discovered. Human scientists had spent the past 6 months studying every aspect of Zelkan biology, psychology, and technology, not to understand them better, but to kill them more efficiently. The intelligence reports arriving from across the galaxy painted a clear picture of the enemy they faced. The Zelkan Confederacy controlled over 200 star systems, commanded fleets numbered in the thousands, and had the backing of several other alien species who viewed humanity as an upstart race that needed to be contained. But intelligence worked both ways. The Zelkans had been monitoring human space with growing alarm, watching as peaceful colonies transformed into military strongholds overnight. Their initial reports had dismissed humanity's response as primitive emotional outbursts that would burn out quickly. They were beginning to realize how wrong they had been. Commander HFY, the architect of New Eden's destruction, had been recalled to the Confederacy capital to brief the High Council on his successful cleansing operation. He expected commendations and perhaps a promotion. Instead, he found himself facing questions about why his simple police action had apparently triggered a species-wide military mobilization. "You assured us that humans were cowards," High Counselor Zethmar hissed, her forearms gesturing at intelligence reports that covered the council chamber's walls. "You said they would submit to superior force as they always have. Explain to us why their military production has increased by 3,000%. HFY's mandibles clicked nervously. "Honored Counselor, the human response is merely the death throes of a species that knows it is beaten. They posture and threaten, but they lack the will to sustain a real military campaign. I recommend we ignore their tantrum and proceed with Phase 2 of the cleansing protocol." The High Counselor's compound eyes fixed on him with predatory intensity. Phase 2 involved eliminating another 12 human colonies. "Given their current military buildup, do you still recommend proceeding?" "Without question," HFY replied, his confidence returning. "Humans are fundamentally weak. Their emotional attachments make them vulnerable. The destruction of a few more settlements will break their spirit completely." What the Zelkan commander didn't understand was that human emotional attachments weren't a weakness. They were the source of humanity's greatest strength. The images of Marcus Chen and the other children had been seared into the collective consciousness of an entire species, creating a unity of purpose that transcended politics, religion, and national boundaries. On Earth, the Global Defense Council had been meeting in continuous session for months. President Vasquez had been granted emergency powers that effectively transformed human civilization into a single military organism. Resources flowed where they were needed without bureaucratic delays. Scientists shared research without patent restrictions. Former enemies worked side by side in the name of a higher cause. General Harrison Burke, who had come out of retirement to lead the ground forces, stood before a holographic display showing the known locations of Zelkan military installations. His staff officers were a mixture of the most experienced commanders in human space and brilliant young minds who had been promoted based on merit rather than seniority. "The Zelkans have made a fundamental error in their assessment of our species," Burke explained to his assembled officers. "They believe that destroying our colonies will demoralize us into submission. They don't understand that every act of aggression only strengthens our resolve." Colonel Maria Santos, formerly a peace negotiator and now the head of psychological warfare, nodded in agreement. "Our intelligence indicates that the Zelkan military doctrine is based on intimidation and superior firepower. They've never faced an opponent who becomes stronger when hurt, more dangerous when cornered. The human military had indeed learned things about warfare that the galaxy had forgotten. While other species relied on overwhelming force or technological superiority, humans had rediscovered the art of asymmetric warfare, guerrilla tactics, and psychological operations. They studied their enemy's culture, exploited their weaknesses, and turned their strengths against them." Captain Lisa Chen, the younger sister of Marcus's father Thomas, commanded one of the fleet's most advanced scout ships. She had volunteered for the most dangerous missions, carrying out reconnaissance deep in Zelkan space. Her ship, the UES Silent Fury, had been modified with experimental stealth technology that made it nearly invisible to alien sensors. Her latest mission had been to observe Zelkan fleet movements near their primary military base in the Rigel sector. What she discovered sent shockwaves through the human command structure. "Admiral," she reported via encrypted transmission, "the Zelkans are mobilizing their entire battle fleet. Over 1,500 ships, including their largest dreadnoughts. They're moving toward human space." Admiral Kim studied the intelligence data with grim satisfaction. "They're bringing their main force to fight us directly. Good. We won't have to hunt them down one by one." The human fleet had been designed specifically for this confrontation. Every ship carried weapon systems that had been optimized to counter Zelkan technology. Every crew had been trained to exploit the psychological weaknesses that Dr. Kane's research had identified. Every strategy had been developed with one goal in mind: the complete destruction of the Zelkan military capability. But humanity's response went beyond military preparation. Across human space, Children were being taught songs about Marcus Chen and the other victims of New Eden. Artists created memorials that captured both the innocence that had been lost and the fury that had been awakened. Writers crafted epic poems that would be recited for generations, ensuring that the sacrifice of New Eden would never be forgotten. The cultural transformation was as complete as the military one. Humanity had shed its naive hope for peaceful coexistence and embraced a darker truth. Sometimes survival required the willingness to be more ruthless than one's enemies. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the former head of the Galactic Peace Institute, now served as the Director of Strategic Intelligence. Her peaceful research into alien cultures had been weaponized into detailed assessments of enemy psychology and tactical doctrine. She understood better than anyone how completely humanity had changed. "We're not the same species that left Earth seeking friendship among the stars," she reported to the president. "The humans who emerge from this conflict will be harder, colder, more suspicious of alien motives. The Zelkins have created their own worst nightmare, a humanity that no longer believes in the possibility of peace." The irony was not lost on human leadership. By trying to eliminate what they saw as a threat, the Zelkins had created an actual threat of unprecedented magnitude. They had transformed a peaceful, scattered collection of colonies into a unified military force driven by a shared trauma and an unshakable desire for justice. As the two fleets moved toward their inevitable confrontation, neither side fully understood what was about to unfold. The Zelkins expected to face the same compliant humans they had always known, weakened by grief and seeking terms for surrender. Instead, they would encounter something the galaxy had never seen: a human species united in its fury and unlimited in its capacity for vengeance. The first engagement would take place in the Kepler 442 system, above the ashes of New Eden. It was fitting that the war would begin where it had started, in the space where Marcus Chen had once dreamed of flying through golden wheat fields under twin suns. Admiral Kim gave the order to advance, and 347 Hu. The two fleets met in the shadow of New Eden's burned world, their massive hulls gleaming against the backdrop of twin suns that had once illuminated Marcus Chen's laughter. The Zelkin armada stretched across space like a steel constellation, 1,500 ships arranged in the traditional battle formations that had served the Confederacy for centuries. Admiral Sarah Kim stood on the bridge of the UES Vengeance, watching the enemy fleet deploy with tactical precision. The Zelkins were confident, their movement steady and predictable. They had brought overwhelming force to crush what they still believed was a grief-stricken species, lashing out in its death throes. "All ships. This is Admiral Kim." Her voice carried across the communication channels to every human vessel. "Today we fight not just for victory, but for the memory of every child who died on the world below us. Today we show the galaxy that humanity's children are not cattle to be slaughtered. Today we teach the universe to fear us." The response from the fleet was immediate and unanimous. 300,000 human voices, raised as one in a war cry that seemed to shake space itself. On every ship and every corridor, men and women who had never known war prepared to unleash the full fury of their awakened species. Commander Vexhai observed the human formation from his flagship and found their arrangement puzzling. Instead of the massive battle line he expected, the human ships were scattered in small groups almost randomly distributed across the engagement zone. It looked like the formation of inexperienced amateurs rather than trained military professionals. "They're afraid," he told his tactical officer. "Look how they spread themselves thin, trying to avoid concentrated fire. We'll sweep through them like wind through wheat." The comparison was more appropriate than he knew. The human formation was indeed inspired by wheat fields, specifically by the way wind moved through grain, creating waves and patterns that seemed chaotic but followed deeper natural laws. Human tactical doctrine had evolved beyond the rigid formations favored by galactic military tradition. The battle began with a massive Zelkan bombardment, their particle beams and plasma cannons unleashing enough energy to sterilize planets. The human ships scattered like startled birds, their formation seeming to collapse under the assault. Several human vessels took critical damage, their hulls cracking under the tremendous firepower. But as the smoke cleared, the Zelkins realized something was wrong. The human ships weren't fleeing or breaking formation. They were repositioning according to a plan that became clear only as it unfolded. Each damaged ship was immediately supported by others, their combined shields creating overlapping protective barriers. Wounded vessels withdrew while fresh ones took their place, maintaining constant pressure on the enemy. Captain Lisa Chen, commanding the UES Silent Fury, led a squadron of stealth ships through the Zelkan battle line. Her vessels were invisible to enemy sensors, moving like ghosts through space to strike at command and control ships. The loss of several command vessels threw the Zelkan formation into confusion just as the human main force launched its counterattack. Marcus-class dreadnoughts revealed their true capabilities as they opened fire with weapon systems that defied conventional understanding. The particle beams were calibrated to specific frequencies that caused maximum damage to Zelkan neural systems. The electromagnetic pulse weapons sent precisely tuned signals that overloaded alien sensory organs, leaving enemy crews blind and disoriented. Dr. Elizabeth Kane's research had been thorough and merciless. Every weapon system had been optimized to exploit Zelkan biology. Sonic charges that disrupted their echolocation abilities, chemical payloads that triggered allergic reactions in their respiratory systems. Even the paint schemes on human ships had been chosen to cause maximum psychological distress to species with compound eyes. But it was the human tactics that proved most devastating. Where Zelkan doctrine emphasized rigid hierarchy and predetermined responses, human commanders were given broad latitude to adapt and improvise. Each ship captain was empowered to make independent decisions based on battlefield conditions, creating a fluid, organic response that the Zelkans couldn't predict or counter. Lieutenant Commander James Park, the youngest ship captain in the fleet, demonstrated this flexibility by leading his destroyer squadron in a series of hit-and-run attacks that seemed to violate every principle of naval warfare. His ships would emerge from behind asteroids, unleash devastating volleys, and disappear before the Zelkans could respond effectively. "This is impossible," Vexhai hissed as he watched his battle line crumble under the unconventional assault. "They're fighting without discipline, without order. How can chaos defeat superior organization?" His tactical officer provided the unwelcome answer. "Sir, their chaos isn't random. It's adaptive. They're responding to our movements faster than our own ships can coordinate responses." The truth was that humanity had learned to fight the way they lived, as individuals working together toward a common goal, rather than as cogs in a military machine. Each human captain brought their own skills, experiences, and insights to the battle, creating a collective intelligence that was greater than the sum of its parts. As the battle raged, the human fleet began to demonstrate capabilities that shocked even their own commanders. Engines that should have been operating at maximum capacity somehow found additional power. Weapon systems that should have overheated continued firing beyond their rated limits. Crews worked with an intensity and coordination that seemed to transcend normal human capabilities. The explanation came from Dr. Martinez, monitoring the battle from Earth. "They're not just fighting for themselves," she reported to President Vasquez. "They're fighting for Marcus Chen and every other child who died. That kind of motivation can push human performance beyond anything we've ever measured." The turning point came when the UES Retribution, one of the newer Marcus-class dreadnoughts, broke through the Zelkan center line and began systematically destroying their capital ships. Captain Thompson, the vessel's commander, had lost his own daughter in a transport accident years earlier, and the images from New Eden had awakened something primal in his soul. His ship carved through the enemy formation like an avenging angel, its weapons reaching out to touch Zelkan vessels with annihilating fire. Each target that fell brought him one step closer to the flagship where Vexhai commanded, one step closer to the creature that had ordered the murder of human children. The Zelkan formation began to collapse as their command structure failed under the relentless human assault. Ships that had fought together for decades found themselves isolated and overwhelmed by human squadrons that seemed to appear from nowhere. The rigid tactical doctrine that had served them so well against other galactic powers proved inadequate against an enemy that refused to fight, according to established rules. Commander, Vexhai watched his fleet disintegrate around him and felt something he had never experienced before: fear. Not the healthy caution of a warrior facing a dangerous opponent, but the deep, existential terror of a predator suddenly realizing it had become prey. "All ships, withdraw to secondary positions," he ordered, his voice cracking with strain. "Regroup and prepare for defensive action." But there would be no regrouping. The human fleet had tasted victory in the blood of their children's killers, and they pressed their advantage with relentless determination. Every Zelkan ship that tried to retreat found itself pursued by human vessels that seemed able to anticipate their movements and cut off their escape routes. Admiral Kim watched the enemy fleet's dissolution with grim satisfaction. This was more than a military victory. It was a message to the entire galaxy. Humanity would no longer submit to alien aggression. They would no longer accept the casual murder of their children. They had become something new, something terrible, something that would reshape the balance of power among the stars. As the last Zelkan ships fled or surrendered, the human fleet regrouped above the ruins of New Eden. The world below was still scarred and lifeless, its wheat fields reduced to ash and its children's laughter silenced forever. But their sacrifice had not been in vain. In dying, they had awakened something in humanity that would ensure no other human child would ever suffer their fate. The Battle of New Eden was over. The war for humanity's place in the galaxy had just begun. 3 years after the Battle of New Eden, the galaxy had learned to speak humanity's name with a mixture of respect and fear. The species that had once begged for acceptance into galactic civilization now sat at the head of the table, their voice carrying weight that made ancient empires tremble. Admiral Sarah Kim, now Grand Admiral of the Terran Defense Coalition, stood before the Galactic Council in what had once been the Zelkan Confederacy's throne world. The massive chamber, built to intimidate lesser species with its alien architecture and overwhelming scale, now hosted a very different kind of gathering. Where once the Zelkan High Council had dictated terms to hundreds of subjugated species, now representatives from across the galaxy came to seek humanity's protection, alliance, or simple mercy. The transformation had been swift and absolute, powered by a human military machine that had proven itself capable of feats the galaxy had thought impossible. The Terran Defense Coalition hereby accepts the surrender of the remaining Zelkan military forces, Kim announced to the assembled delegates. Her words were translated into thousands of languages and broadcast across civilized space. All Zelkan worlds will be placed under transitional administration, pending the establishment of new governments that respect the rights of all sentient beings. In the audience, former enemies sat beside new allies. The Rigelian Collective, which had initially supported the Zelkan Confederacy, now sought human protection from the very species they had once helped arm. The crystalline entities of the Vegan hegemony, who had considered humanity too primitive for meaningful contact, now offered their advanced technology in exchange for inclusion in humanity's expanding sphere of influence. But it was the human delegation itself that truly demonstrated how completely the species had transformed. These were not the desperate petitioners who had once sought scraps of acceptance from alien powers. These were conquerors who had reshaped the galaxy through will, technology, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. Dr. Elizabeth Kane, now Director of Xenobiological Sciences for the Coalition, presented her latest report to the Assembly. The brilliant scientist who had once advocated for peaceful coexistence now served as humanity's expert on alien vulnerabilities and the architect of defensive measures that ensured no species would ever again pose a threat to human children. The biological surveys of former Zelkan territories are complete, she announced. We have identified 17 species that were systematically enslaved or exterminated by Zelkan forces. The Coalition will provide reparations and support for the reconstruction of their civilizations. It was a gesture that spoke to humanity's fundamental character, even in victory. Even after suffering the worst atrocity imaginable, they had not become the monsters their enemies claimed they were. Instead, they had become something perhaps more dangerous, an implacable force for justice that would reshape the galaxy according to their own moral standards. Commander Vexhai, the architect of New Eden's destruction, knelt in chains before the human tribunal. His forearms, once capable of crushing human skulls, were bound with quantum restraints that made escape impossible. His compound eyes, designed to track multiple targets simultaneously, could only stare at the floor in defeat and shame. You are charged with genocide, war crimes, and crimes against sentience, the human judge read from the formal indictment. How do you answer these charges? Vexhai's mandibles clicked weakly. I was following orders. The Confederacy deemed human expansion a threat to galactic stability. I acted to preserve the greater good. The response from the human gallery was immediate and unified. Laughter. Not the cruel mockery of victorious enemies, but the bitter amusement of survivors who had heard every possible justification for the unjustifiable. The Nuremberg defense, Captain Lisa Chen observed from her seat in the witness section. They've been using that excuse for genocide since before we reached the stars. The trial would last for months, not because the evidence was complex, but because humanity wanted the galaxy to understand exactly what had happened and why it could never be allowed to happen again. Every detail of the New Eden massacre was presented with clinical precision. Every order, every decision, every moment of casual cruelty was documented for posterity. But the trial's most powerful moments came when the survivors testified. Thomas and Sarah Chen, who had watched their son die in thermal fire, spoke with quiet dignity about the boy who had loved to run through wheat fields under twin suns. Luna Okafor, now 16 and studying xenobiology at the Terran Naval Academy, described watching her father murdered for trying to explain that his equipment was civilian in nature. Their words carried more weight than any military victory. They transformed abstract concepts of justice and vengeance into human stories that resonated across species lines. Even aliens who had never seen a human child understood the fundamental wrongness of what had been done. The verdict was unanimous and absolute. Vex High and his senior officers were sentenced to life imprisonment on a penal world, where they would spend their remaining years contemplating the consequences of their actions. The Zelkan Confederacy as a political entity was dissolved, its territories redistributed among the species it had oppressed. But the real transformation went deeper than political structures or military victories. Humanity had discovered something about itself during those dark years of preparation and war. They were not just survivors, but natural leaders who could unite disparate species around common principles of justice and mutual protection. The Terran Defense Coalition grew from 57 founding species to over 300 within 2 years. Worlds that had never known peace suddenly found themselves protected by human fleets that patrolled their space lanes and defended their borders. Species that had been enemies for millennia discovered they could cooperate under human mediation. President Vasquez, now serving her third term as head of the coalition government, addressed the transformed reality during the 3rd anniversary commemoration of New Eden. The ceremony was broadcast to every coalition world, watched by trillions of beings who had come to see humanity as the galaxy's moral center. 3 years ago, we lost our innocence in the wheat fields of a distant world, she said, her voice carrying across space to reach every corner of known civilization. Marcus Chen and 23 other children died because the galaxy believed that some species mattered less than others. Today we ensure that no child of any species will ever face such hatred again. Behind her, a memorial wall displayed the names and images of every being who had died in the New Eden massacre. Marcus Chen's 8-year-old face smiled down at the assembly, frozen in eternal youth but somehow seeming to approve of what his species had become in his memory. The memorial was just one of thousands that had been erected across human space. Every coalition world had its own monument to the children who had died, so that the galaxy might learn the cost of casual cruelty. Their sacrifice had become the foundation of a new galactic order, based on protection rather than domination. Dr. Marcus Thompson, designer of the Marcus-class dreadnoughts, had lived to see his weapons become instruments of peace rather than war. The ships that had once brought terror to humanity's enemies now served as guardians for species that had never known security. Their very presence in a star system was enough to deter aggression and maintain stability. The transformation was not without its costs. Humanity had become harder, more suspicious, less willing to trust in alien motivations. They had learned that good intentions and peaceful aspirations were not enough to guarantee survival in a hostile universe. They had become the guardians of galactic civilization, but the role had changed them in fundamental ways. Yet as Admiral Kim stood on the bridge of her flagship, now patrolling space that had once belonged to humanity's greatest enemies, she felt a deep satisfaction. The wheat fields of New Eden would never grow again, but human children ran and played on 1,000 worlds under alien suns, protected by fleets that would never again allow innocents to be slaughtered for political convenience. Marcus Chen's laughter had been silenced, but his legacy echoed across the galaxy in the voices of children who would never know the fear he had experienced in his final moments. In dying, He had taught an entire species that some things were worth any price to defend. The galaxy had learned to fear humanity's anger. Now it was learning to respect humanity's justice. The age of human dominance had begun not through conquest, but through the simple recognition that those who would protect the innocent must be strong enough to destroy those who would harm them. The boy who had dreamed of flying through golden wheat fields had indeed learned to fly, not through space, but through the collective memory and moral commitment of a species that would never forget the price of his dreams.